Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Cincinnati Children's Pediatric Grand Rounds. Today is February 15th, 2022. I'm Scott Callahan. Reminder to everyone, next year's Super Bowl is February 12th in Glendale, Arizona. There are direct flights from CVG. It's not too early to get your tickets. If you are participating live, you will need to text today's unique code to receive credit. The code and phone number will be displayed again at the end of the presentation. If you are watching this live, we would love your feedback on today's talk within 24 hours, so please use the QR code link being displayed before and after the presentation. You may bookmark this forum for future sessions. If you are watching this as part of our on-demand Pediatric Grand Rounds, use the post-test link to claim credit and provide feedback. Please use the QR code being displayed to provide feedback on today's Pediatric Grand Rounds. Limited in-person attendance is now allowed at Pediatric Grand Rounds. We will announce room capacity limits in each week's reminder email. Virtual participation options will continue to be offered. Next week's Grand Rounds will be Religious and Spiritual Struggles and its connection with depression and anxiety amongst adolescents admitted to inpatient psychiatry. The delightful Salvador Levitt Alcantara chaplain and Elizabeth Depp, chaplain 2, will be presenting that. Today's Grand Rounds topic, the origin of Kurome, a case study in working with Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures. The presenters will be Abram Gordon, VP of Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures, Daniel Starzanowski, PhD, Professor of Catherine Stewart Waters Endowed Chair of Hematology Malignancies, Co-Chief Scientific Officer, Innovation Ventures and Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Jan Rosenbaum, PhD, CEO and President, Kurome Therapeutics, and Mike Venerable, CEO and Managing Director of Cincy Tech. After Q&A, just remember the code will be displayed again. So Abram Gordon is Vice President of Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures and Executive Director of the Cincinnati Children's Proton Therapy Center. Abram has led Proton since June 2014, overseeing building construction and integration of the center into medical center operations. Since late 2019, Gordon has also managed Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures, the hospital's technology transfer and commercialization service. Abram Gordon actively serves as a member of the board of directors of Kurome Therapeutics, Include Health, BioOhio, Stack Pharma, and Cincy Tech, as well as board observer on Bexion and Enable Injections and Aruvant Sciences. Abram is well-versed in the greater Cincinnati innovation ecosystem. I look forward to hearing him tell us more about Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for having me. First of all, I wanted to thank our Innovation Ventures team, and in particular Eileen Yo, for all the work they put into this presentation. Cincinnati Children's Innovation Ventures is the hospital's technology transfer office. You may be asking, what is technology transfer? It's the process of transferring or licensing what you might discover in the lab or in the clinic within our walls to a commercial enterprise in order to get it to the bedside. If you work with our office and disclose your innovation to us with enough notice, we can provide legal protection, such as patent protection, but technology transfer is more than intellectual property protection. We work with you to strategize how to take the discovery beyond our walls, to validate it, to show it to industry and investors for feedback, and to optimize it. Success is in the creation of potential and hopefully the creation of value for the patient by licensing it to a company that can turn it into a market-ready and patient-ready product. Your research aim and commercialization can coexist. Technology transfer may start with an idea, but it doesn't end with one patent, nor does it always end with a startup like it did in the case of Kurome Therapeutics. To be clear, our goal is to get it to the bedside as soon as possible. Sometimes we're able to license the technologies directly to industry who can begin to use it right away. Other times we need an intermediate step along the way who can raise large sums of money to advance technologies and get it through the FDA process. It really isn't an either-or proposition. Technology transfer is not a short process, as you'll hear from Dan, nor is success guaranteed. We can improve your chances by collaborating with industry veterans like Jan Rosenbaum, talking with venture capital providers like Mike Venerable, finding resources to take you down the commercialization pathway, whether that's our innovation fund or government or industry sponsored programs. No one can do this difficult work alone. That's why instead of tech transfer, we are calling our work Innovate Together. This is a mutual commitment between innovation ventures and inventors to bring new technology, new ways to patients. I want to introduce our great panel. Dan Starksnowski earned his PhD from Boston University, 2022 Beanpot champs, and did his postdoctoral fellowship at the British Columbia Cancer Research Center in Vancouver. Dan is currently the Catherine Stewart Waters Endowed Chair in Hematologic Malignancies, professor in pediatrics, and co-leader of the Hematologic Malignancies Program at Cincinnati Children's. He serves as the co-scientific officer for Innovation Ventures along with colleague Rashmi Hedge. Dan, if you give a brief explanation of the technology that was licensed to Kurome and your path from lab to Kurome.
Thanks, Abe, and thanks for the introduction. And I just want to thank Innovation Ventures for organizing this event and for allowing me to share the stage with Jan and Mike, who've been an important part of this journey. So, so Kurome Therapeutics is an early-stage biotech company here in Cincinnati, focused on the discovery of novel cancer therapeutics, and particularly for cancers that are resistant to conventional therapies. And as you just heard from Abe, it was spun out of work based out of my lab here in Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And so by early stage, we mean it's still preclinical, where we've have a great team and made tremendous progress over the last couple of years, and marching closer to identifying a clinical candidate and going into the clinic. So my lab and our team work on blood cancers, and particularly myelodysplastic syndromes and acute myeloid leukemia. And we're focused on understanding the genetic, molecular, and cellular basis of these diseases. And so our mission in the lab is to perform rigorous mechanistic studies to understand the process by which these blood cancers develop, but with a keen eye on novel therapeutic targets and understanding therapeutic vulnerabilities that we can then pursue. And it was through that process that Kurome Therapeutics emerged. And so it's been 10 plus years where we've been working on research related that eventually led to Kurome Therapeutics. And it was, started off with several foundational observations related to how leukemia cells develop. And what we uncovered early on is a novel signaling pathway, or a signaling hub, in these leukemic cells that's important for their function and resistance to therapies. And this signaling hub and pathway normally functions in immune cells to sense foreign pathogens, bacteria, and viruses. But in these leukemic cells, we found that it was hijacked, if you will, in the leukemic cells for their own benefit. And central to this signaling pathway are these two kinases called IRAK1 and IRAK4. And so over the last 10 years, we sort of had three foundational observations that sort of served as the foundation for Kurome. The first is we demonstrated that IRAK1 and 4 kinases are activated in leukemic cells. Two, we performed genetic and pharmacological studies to validate these targets and show that they're indeed important for the function of these leukemic cells. And then more recently, we uncovered the genetic basis for why IRAK1 and 4 are hijacked in these leukemic cells. In other words, we uncovered some of the mutations, the genetic drivers in these leukemic cells that results in hijacking of this signaling hub. And so we were at an interesting position where we uncovered a novel, perhaps therapeutic target in these cancers for which there were no clinical grade inhibitors or therapies available at the time. And maybe the fourth important part of this journey was the collaboration, a fortuitous collaboration with Craig Thomas at the NIH. And as we were building this story, he was very much interested in these IRAK targets in cancer, and he leads a drug discovery group at the NIH. And so we've been actively working together. And so he is the chemistry sort of brains behind this. I've been working on the biology. And so over the years, before Kurome was formed, he was already developing small molecules to target specifically these two kinases for oncology. And so he was able to really effectively develop what are called tool compounds. And so these are small molecules that aren't drug-like yet, but establish the proof of concept studies that I think got Jan excited when we started socializing this technology. And so that sort of was this 10-year plus journey of science and collaborations, fortuitous interactions that got us to where we are now.
Thanks, Dan. Next, I want to introduce our other two panelists. Jan Rosenbaum, PhD, who is Kurome's president, CEO, and chief scientific officer, is a drug development professional, an inventor on 12 patents, and has more than 25 years of pharma biotechnical management experience. Jan is the former chief scientific officer of Airway Therapeutics, a 2011 spin-out of Cincinnati Children's that is also a Cincinnati portfolio company. Mike Venerable is a successful software industry entrepreneur and venture capital investor. Through Cincinnati, a public-private seed stage investor, he has led the formation and management of 5 funds that have invested in 85 bioscience, healthcare, and digital companies exclusively in Ohio. Jan and Mike, please give a little background on your involvement in Kurome, but also for those in our audience either have disclosed ideas to our office or have ideas we're working on things that may lead to commercialization. What are the boxes that need to be checked in order for you to decide to invest time or dollars? And how did Dan's idea check those boxes to lead to the creation of Kurome?
So I had actually been involved with Children's for over 10 years before I got involved with Kurome. And that started with my relationship with Mike and Cincinnati. And Children's asked me to come get involved with Dan because they knew they had an opportunity that would be of interest to the venture community. And they actually weren't getting much traction with that, and they wanted to understand why. And it turned out that the way that they were pitching Dan's invention was around one aspect of what it was he was doing. And when venture looked at that, it looked to them as if it was a Me Too. And when I looked at what Dan was doing through my conversations with Dan, I realized that there was a lot more to what it was he was doing than the way that it had been looked at before. And there were actually 3 different aspects to his technology, and that's what made it so attractive. So there was the concept that it hit the FLT3 target, which was what Innovations was originally considering. And then there was this concept that Dan talked about, that it was inhibiting IRAK1 and IRAK4, which actually hit this critical signaling node that was involved in so many different aspects in both hematological cancers as well as solid tumors. And then beyond that, Dan was also working on developing what we believed could be turned into a diagnostic to identify patients that would actually be predisposed to be responding to the drug. So there were 3 aspects to what we were able to develop into a value proposition and build a business case. And there were already patents filed, so we had protection in this. And that's what made it an attractive proposition from a business standpoint. So it was something that was novel. It was something that allowed us to go beyond what was already out there, and there was a hook to get people interested, and there was patent protection. And then as we started socializing it with other investors and people who were really experienced in the AML business space, they told us we would still have problems. And they told us we would have problems because the AML space was so crowded. And there was an emerging technology, something that's called Venclexta now, which is venetoclax, that was going to take the market. And they said, you're not going to be able to compete with this drug. And a light bulb went off. And I said, wait a minute, Dan holds a patent. Children's holds a patent on the way these IRAC inhibitors combine with venetoclax, and the future in AML is combination therapy. And when I started presenting that aspect of Dan's technology, everybody got excited. So we pivoted very early in the way we were thinking about this. And I think that's one of the key things that everybody needs to think about when we talk about commercialization. It's not just the strength of the IP or how novel the initial invention is, but it's what is it about the technology that's going to lead to success, not just in the clinic today, but in the evolving market. Because by the time this technology gets to the market, it's going to be 10, 15 years down the road. So we have to think about how the field is evolving and how the clinical situation is evolving. Mike?
Sure, and I want to recognize John Rice, who's a colleague of mine and leads our life science practice, who's not here and who was more deeply involved in this. He couldn't be here today. So I come at this from a purely non-PhD, non-bioscience background, more as an investor. And I would say Jan said it really well, like these things are almost from the beginning when we're introduced to a new and novel thing, we're looking for, novelty is a hard thing to define in this highly specialized world that you work in. So it takes time to develop a real point of view around that, and it requires us to build a sort of a community of interest, people that can validate what we're thinking, can identify the gaps, and then we're looking for a pretty high threshold in terms of what's the value of this technology in the marketplace. And that threshold is we're really looking to fund things, fund ideas and companies that can be worth $500 million or more. So in the world of startup investing, $500 million is actually not as common as you might think by reading about big successes out there. But most companies don't progress to that stage. Most ideas don't have that much sort of commercial power. And it's really important to gain this context, to understand how big is the opportunity, because candidly, that's how novel technologies that have huge clinical impact get to market. And the one thing I would say is the highest bar we have is not economic. We assume economics will work out. We assume the product will get through the regulatory process if it has a significant impact on clinical outcomes. That's sort of the first hurdle, because if it's a compelling technology that changes the outcome, even for a small population in cases of some orphan drugs, it will make it through the process. But it's really important for us to have, I've worked with Jan for over 10 years. Her opinion on something matters to me more than almost anybody else's, because I know she's building that understanding, that deep understanding, connecting to other people to build that point of view.
Thank you. Dan, what was your motivation for commercialization? How were you exposed to it, and how long have you been interested in commercialization?
So to be frank, as a basic scientist without any business background, or it never really crossed my mind. Other than the motivation is, how can we create impact? As basic scientists, we can create impact in our field in different ways. And one of those ways is through commercialization. It really didn't come onto my radar until probably engaging with Innovation Ventures, when I arrived here, and trying to understand that process a little bit more, and understanding what type of technology, perhaps coming out of my lab, even has legs to stand on in that process. So it's nothing that was inherently, ingrained in me as a process in the way we do science, but more keeping, sort of keeping an eye out for those types of opportunities and listening to people around me.
Jan, what are some of the best practices that you see during your interactions with academic institutions and inventors that really make things click between both of you, and how you can see value in what's being developed?
Well, the first best practice is to make sure that things get patented. And there's a culture that develops around patenting. So there's the investigators themselves have to be aware of the patent process. The organization, like Innovation Ventures, has to know what to put in the claims. So, and they have to work with the investigators to make sure they get the data so that they can construct the claims. And they have to have an eye on how this is going to be commercialized, so the claims are constructed with the market in mind. Because if claims are constructed to support how the technology is going to be commercialized, then once the technology gets licensed to somebody, the patent has to be reworked. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is that if we're considering commercializing something, the investigator has to be aware that it has to be protected before it's disclosed. And there's a lot of different ways that disclosures can happen. I work with organizations all over the place. And you know, even things like writing something in a grant proposal is constituted as a disclosure. Presenting at a meeting is constituted as a disclosure. So you have to make sure that you patent anything that you think can be commercialized so that it's protected before you disclose it in public. And so organizations that are effective at building that culture of protecting their IP are more attractive as a source of commercializable material. Organizations that reward innovation are more attractive as a source of commercializable material. In the drug discovery space, organizations that support connections to other organizations that have med-chem expertise are attractive. And because that's a big outage. We don't have big medicinal chemistry departments here in Cincinnati. But we have connections to other organizations, like Dan has the connection to NCATS. That was another aspect that made this a really, really attractive technology to invest in.
Okay. Mike, what are your expectations of a scientific founder?
So I think the most important thing to think about is, if you're a scientific founder, is you have to sort of define your boundary, how far you want to go into the commercialization process, and then, you know, let people know that at the beginning. If you're really, in some cases, you may need to collaborate with internal resources like CCIV. You'll have to collaborate with external resources, but you know, really the scientific founder has to decide how involved they want to be in the commercialization process, any future company that comes out, and just be comfortable with expressing that and saying, this is what I'd like to do. There are some inventors who we would say they're sort of over the transom inventors. They just throw it over and, call me if you have any questions, but I want to go back to my lab or my clinical work, and that's where I want to focus. There are others who come out into companies and become, key members of management in that company. That's definitely true in like a medical device company I can think of, where we have a physician who invented a medical device, and they're deeply involved in the management of the company. They still practice, but they're clearly an executive in the business. So you have to decide that up front. I think that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think, and I think Dan's a good example of this, you have to be a collaborator. And that's not just a collaborator with CCIV and other people who may be involved in investing in your company, but are you finding ways to collaborate and advance your technology or bring resources that you may not have at hand to the table? And are you validating what you have and continue to advance it? And I think that leads to success. And I can tell you this, I'm sort of an introverted person, so collaboration, you have to sort of decide you're going to do it and be intentional about it. So I understand that not everybody wants to do that. So figure out, okay, how can I collaborate? Who can I collaborate with? Build that network of support and interest for what you're doing. And it'll actually end up doing less work yourself, and you can focus on what you really like to do if you get other people to if you can trick them into helping you in ways that you don't really want to do.
Thanks.
And if I can build on that, with a lot of companies that I see, starting from the very beginning, the companies that work are the ones where there's a chemistry between the folks who are running the company and the scientific founders. It clicks or it doesn't click. And companies do not succeed unless there's a strong technical grounding within the company. And that's where the collaboration exists between the company and the scientific founders. And it gets really ugly when there's a falling out between the scientific founders and the company. And yet there's a point in company evolution where it gets handed off and the company goes off, and then the scientific founders just aren't involved anymore. But there has to be that chemistry in the beginning. There has to be a trust between the founders who are handing over their baby to somebody else who's going to develop it and the company. And it works best when there's that chemistry between the two organizations.
So Dan, I know you're not at that point of fully handing it off yet. You're very involved, and it's still early in the process. But what do you know now that you wish you knew when this all started?
Well, first of all, sitting here, I realized, through these last few years, realized how little I knew about the process, when we started. And so that certainly was eye-opening. And so, why did I do it? Why did I keep, pushing forward? Part of it was I had quickly a great team around me of mentors, and Jan, I'm sure you can sense her passion for this, and having her as a champion and a key opinion leader in my corner was really important, because it was I had this team with Jan, among others, in Innovation Ventures, where I could quickly ping them, email them, ask them questions, jump on a call to help me understand what this process is all about. And kind of maybe coming back to my Boston roots, being in the center of the world of biotech, I think maybe some of that has just rubbed off on me, and seeing my scientific colleagues seamlessly moving back and forth between their academic labs and industry relationship, and seeing that it can be possible. Again, the advice they gave me is you need to have a great team along for the ride, and so that's certainly knowing how important that is, and how lucky we were early on to have that champion with Cincinnati Tech Innovation Ventures, and particularly Jan, to kind of get us out of the gate.
Did you have, you talk about not having any experience in the commercialization pathway before Kurome, but did you have expectations about what it would be like working with industry and VCs before, or were any myths busted?
So I kind of came into this sort of with naive optimism. So I really didn't have set expectations, because I knew those would probably be shattered anyway, given the conversations I've had with colleagues who've gone through this process. But certainly, I had to overcome some of these academic tendencies that we have, as basic scientists, and realizing quickly that my academic interests don't always align with the commercialization process. And so what I might think is important in the next step of a scientific story, publication, grant, doesn't necessarily always align with what's best for the commercialization process, what's best for raising money, what's best for generating enthusiasm from investors. And for me, I had to kind of quickly learn, and again, this was also through the guidance and exposure that I was receiving, that this commercialization process isn't like a one-lane off-ramp, that there's different ways that this all can work itself out and progress. And even from the standpoint of engaging with investors and different VCs, all of them have their own investment thesis and risk tolerance, and understanding what that risk tolerance is and investment thesis for these venture capital firms was really important, because you'll never engage a VC or a partner around a technology. It could be the greatest technology, but if it doesn't fit their investment thesis and risk tolerance, then it's not going to work. So trying to understand where the investors are coming from, what they're looking for, how do they want to de-risk technologies, what's their comfort level for investing, where some of these academic sort of tendencies we don't really think of as academics, that I had to really try to embrace.
Thanks.
I think the other thing, and this was a learning for me too, is that when you pitch your technologies to investors, you're challenged in ways that you've never been challenged before. So we all defended our theses. And, when you write grants, the grant committees are merciless. That's nothing in comparison to pitching to a VC. They rip you apart, and it's all oral. So you're up there, and if you're postmenopausal, you can't sweat. So, and it's just question after question after question, and Dan's the expert in his field. And they question everything he did. It's absolutely incredible. And you have to emerge from that completely cool, and you just have to answer all of their questions. Because not only are they interested in how good your science is, but they're interested in how much you know and how well you're able to defend it. And I think that when you're in a university, while you're used to scrutiny and you're used to discussions where ideas are challenged, it's at a different level. And you can't get upset about it because they're going to invest a lot of money in what it is that you're doing.
Can I just double click on that thought? Absolutely. It was being constantly challenged about everything you've done, about what others have done on the spot was a humbling experience. And it certainly brought back, some of those thesis committees and, thesis defenses back. But even to an nth degree, because, the people you're talking to have, potentially skin in the game. And so they're going to uncover every wart on your research program. And, during some of these discussions that we were defending, they were pulling out supplemental figures from papers of, 10 years ago and asking us about specific details. And, sort of doing that on the spot, considering what's on the line, was perhaps, a fun experience, but certainly a learning experience, and through it a humbling one, and where you really have to kind of put your ego aside and stay calm and cool, because it does feel like a sword fight where you're sort of back and forth in these discussions, and they challenge you on everything.
I hope we were more cordial than that. Scrutiny. Yeah. The farther you go, the more combative it can get in the capital cycle. But yeah, it's very much a journey of discovery for the investor to find out, is this really, there are hundreds of things we'll look at in a year. We get to the point where we're digging in very deeply on something that we're really putting, you think about it, we take other people's money and put it to work in these novel ideas and concepts. The people who gave us the money probably don't have a lot of an understanding even what we're doing in terms of the research and things like that we're looking at. So there's a lot of scrutiny, but I hope it felt collaborative, at least in our context. We're trying to really learn up front because we're getting ready for that next level of scrutiny, because we want you to get through that next stage of financing and on to the future.
Maybe I was just going to kind of, bit of advice for anyone thinking to immerse themselves in this experience is not to take any of it personally. And I think, it can feel personal at the time because your research is being attacked and scrutinized. But the most important is, again, trying to, like Jan was saying, staying as calm and collective as possible, and understanding where they're coming from, which is, they need to be comfortable with the investment that they're going to potentially put into this technology.
So Mike, just kind of a follow on a bit. So do you see technologies competing with themselves for your dollars, or do you look at the opportunity?
We definitely only have, so many investments we can make at any given time, and any fund that we raise, and that happens all the way down the continuum of financing. So we're very early seed stage investors, all the way to, people that are making choices to fund companies before they go public. Everybody has a finite amount of capital. You're trying to deploy that capital and make a return, and so you have to be selective. So we use a term that may sound kind of trite, but undeniably better is sort of our threshold. That's our decision point. It's like, does this look completely different and better than the other things we're looking at right now? And I can tell you, you can be in the middle of a deep process with an idea or a company you're thinking about, and something, and especially if you're at the end of a fund, you have just a few slots left, somebody shows up and they can displace an idea that's already there. And you just say, well, this is just better. And you just have to do that because that's sort of the the Darwinian process we're in. We're trying to find the best things and advance them so we can generate more capital and returns to do more. And this is, we've done, I think, 12, 13 companies now out of Cincinnati Children's. We've in-licensed 3 other technologies into companies we funded in other ways. There's great stuff here. It's a really incredible place, but each of the ideas is competing with some other idea from here or from somewhere else that we might deploy our capital.
But Mike, it's not just the idea or the technology that you're investing in, it's also the team that's built around it, correct?
Well, it's the team that we're building around it, yeah. So we have to, and that's sort of a process in and of itself to find the outside person who's going to run it. Because again, rarely does the inventor become the leader of the business externally. It's not impossible. It's just uncommon. So in this case, because we had known Jan forever and worked with her forever, not forever, but for a long time, it was a really sort of a comforting opportunity for us to say, well, this is she and Dan were clearly collaborating at a high level. That's exactly what you want. And then from there you can build out and from that team. But actually the hardest thing is to find that one person who, so think of it this way. I always say, what am I looking for? I'm looking for the person who embodies the concept, the idea. And that's relatively straightforward. Who's the sort of the intellectual engine that's going to drive it? And then who are they going to partner with that's going to drive that to market and sort of understands and sort of feeds off that intellectual energy and then drives that into the marketplace. And this is a really great example of that working out really well, that dyad that you start with. And we do that in software companies as well. Who's the software sort of genius who's driving it, and then who understands the market and how to do that. Create that dyad, get that right at the beginning, your odds of success are much higher.
So Dan, you have, kind of following up on your last answer, you have additional technologies in our office. What have you learned from the process that you might do differently as you help move those other technologies along the commercialization journey?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to be touching upon a theme that I've been mentioning. Again, getting the technology in front of other experts often as possible to get their feedback, get those knee-jerk reactions, and continually refine the pitch. It's through that process of presentation, feedback, refinement that I think it slowly gets it ready, hopefully for some sort of exit. I think again also looking for the second part of this theme is trying to think about what would be a good team to put around these technologies and the type of partner that is suitable for this technology to succeed. So I think going through it once doesn't necessarily will prepare me for the second time around, but I think knowing the questions to ask, managing expectations a little bit better, and as I stated earlier, sort of knowing what I don't know and that being okay as an academic is knowing. Hopefully we'll get a champion behind this, mentors, and then hopefully investors. They'll allow us to again, give another shot.
Mike, hopefully this isn't a situation with Kurome, but what's the biggest reason you believe that causes technologies or startups to fail?
Well, I'm a bad person to ask this question of. We've made 85 investments. So I'm an entrepreneur. Before I came to this work, I built and sold a business back in the late 90s with a friend. Every investment we made that didn't work out, I can tell you how it could still work out. I mean, you have to have a fundamental sort of optimistic view. I think, so some things fail because the timing is just wrong. It's not, the market is not ready, or you missed the market. The window is, we always say we invest early. I just never know how early. We're not late investors, we're early investors. And sometimes things just don't align and the thing you've invested in isn't relevant anymore. That happens. There are cases where the technology or the solution you're trying to build and try to translate, especially in cases like this, it just takes too long and it becomes too capital intensive and people just get worn out. Literally just like, we're not going to put any more money in that. We can't keep going. There's another 30 million to get to the next stage, and we've already put 100 million in aggregate. I mean, those things happen too. People just get worn out. Rarely, I mean, I would say that, teams can destroy companies if they're dysfunctional, definitely. But usually there's enough governance around these kind of companies that sort of gets worked out. It cannot be, it's maybe not a fun process, but it gets sorted out. We need to improve the team or change out leadership, that kind of thing. But I would say mostly things fail because they just run out of money, or they're poorly timed to the market. Something else, trumps them. Or in the case of, I would say, the last 2 years is really instructive. There were just major changes in what people cared about in biotech investing in the last 2 years. And the same thing you're all consumers, you see this in how you order and experience the consumer economy today. Things that people were interested in investing in 2.5 years ago, they could care less about today. They've completely moved on to other applications, other needs. So it's, I think the key to making things, if you start with really novel, something very novel, and it addresses a large unmet need, that's your best chance to make it, and just not everything makes it.
Thanks. Jan, coming back to Kurome, what's the biggest iteration or change so far in the development of the technology at Kurome? Whether that was a surprise or
I think we've evolved what the way we're thinking about a first-to-market indication. And that's because we've learned more about how these compounds work, and the AML field is evolving. So when we got into this, it was just on the cusp of other small molecules getting approved for AML. So when we got into this, targeted therapies were just beginning for AML. It was standard chemo, and that was it. And then we had 4 new therapies being approved. And now more and more therapies are getting approved. And so we have to think more about niche marketing in AML than we did at the beginning of Kurome. And the field is evolving more towards combination therapies. So we're uncovering more about how our compounds work, and that's feeding back to how we're thinking about what the market is going to look like. So we started with a rather simple target product profile, and now we have a target product profile that has 8 or so different possible scenarios that we're working against. And as we get more data, we ask ourselves, which target product profile are we going after? And so it's a constantly evolving thing as we optimize our compounds. And that wasn't how we were thinking about it at the beginning.
Jan, you describe it as evolving. For me, as an academic, it's a roller coaster ride. Yeah. Every day there's something new, and we have to be extremely nimble and pivoting and adjusting on what sometimes feels a nearly daily basis. So as an academic scientist, where we tend to sort of have control over our daily process, you have to give up a lot of that control and just go for this roller coaster ride.
Dan, you speaking of that though, you've commented to me many times about the change in mindset from the investors on how you talk about and think about the competition. Can you talk about that a bit?
So maybe I'll preface by saying that you have all your connections in the academic world, and it's a fairly small environment, and then there's this whole investment world, and they all know each other, and you sort of step foot into this investment and quickly realize how everyone is connected, and so one of the things I learned was how to describe other competitor technologies. The knee-jerk reaction when you're describing a competitor's technology is you want to point out their weaknesses, minimize the potential impact, and state how much better you are, right? And so as one example, I had a call, an investor called and wanted to get my perspective on a competitor's technology. And so I was objective, and I described it as I thought through an objective scientific lens. And then within probably about 15 minutes, I got a call from one of the investors looking to invest in Kurome said, hey, I just got off the call with somebody you just talked to. You need to be positioning this competitor in a much stronger light. And so two things I realized. One is how everyone is connected and it's this small world. And two is the competitor's success actually helps us as a company. And so they de-risk the technologies. And so again, it's just this mindset of how to position our technology in this rapidly changing environment of other therapies coming onto the market, other therapies that might resemble sort of what we're doing, and again, communicating that in a way where it gets investors excited. They realize the upside on what some of the our technology, but not to diminish the potential of another one. So again, it's a very interesting mindset that it was pointed out to me I had to change quite quickly.
And before I hand this back to Scott for additional Q&A from the audience, Mike, can you just talk a little bit about the evolution of the Cincinnati innovation ecosystem and kind of how far it's come and what its trajectory is?
Sure. So I moved back here in 2004 from the East Coast, but I grew up in the area. It's amazing when you live somewhere for a long time how much it changes while you're gone. But I would say we live in a completely different environment. I can tell you that when I started at Cincy Tech kind of around 2007, we started investing. It never occurred to me that we would invest in 85 companies. That wasn't really in my head. It's like, we'll see where this goes, what's here. I didn't think we would invest over $100 million directly in things. I didn't think our core goal was to find great things here, and then your real measurement, because these companies take so long, is will other people vote with their dollars who otherwise could put their money elsewhere? So we've had over $1.4 billion, I think now, or approaching $1.4 billion invested in across our portfolio of co-investment. A lot of that money from world-class, investors, both strategic and venture investors from all over the country and the world. So that shows that we now know that in this region we have great assets. We have great startup assets. Remarkably, we also have great talent and other resources because we're able to import IP from other institutions outside the region and build companies around that intellectual property as well. So, we have a much more active investor class that's very comfortable putting their dollars against this kind of technology in our fund and other funds that are starting in the region. You're starting to see some diversification even in different kinds of funds forming, later stage funds. So I think we've come a long way. I think we're, barely tapping the potential. I think there's I would say we've progressed an order of magnitude, and then I'd say there's at least a couple orders of magnitude left to go, but it's sort of a step change. You sort of get, work for 14 years, make a bunch of investments, people look back and say, hey, this is starting to work out. We're starting to generate, significant returns. We're seeing companies that are, what I would call soonicorns. They're not unicorns yet, but they're soonicorns, show up. It's kind of cool. And that, and every day, over 150 funds and investors that I know of that don't live here or work here realize they have an investment in the region. And many of those have investments in technologies that have come out of Cincinnati Children's, which is very cool. So I just think we're in a completely different environment when I got here. There are also a lot more restaurants and other things, and we have a better football team now. So at both UC and the professional one as well. So
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, everyone. I did get one question from Dr. Chambrella, and maybe this one's best for Jan and Mike, if I had to guess. Of all the innovative products out there that have been developed, how many had their origins in the academic, scientific, university community? I'm not sure if Ernie is looking for just a ballpark percentage.
So there have been a lot of articles that have been written on this. There's a definite trend in the pharmaceutical industry to move early discovery out of the major companies, and the innovations are coming from the universities and small biotech and being developed there and then moving into big pharma later. So I don't have a number, but if you look over time, there's a much larger percentage of drugs that have been developed that have originated from academia and small biotech versus out of the pharmaceutical industry itself. So our universities are definitely making a contribution to what's being developed.
My answer is pretty simple. It's all. So they're not all direct, but they're all derivative of, research is interesting. MIT did release some strange study recently that said the way to track what innovation to invest in is to look at physics. The novel physics drives a lot of innovation. So if you think about all the computational discovery that goes on today in your world, I just think that we're just looking for the very best ideas, the breakthrough ideas that really emerge from people who have the time to who are basically allowed to sit around and think about those ideas, how to practice them, how to apply them, and that drives so much of what we do.
And Dan, maybe I'll direct this one to you. As a poor, humble pediatrician, general pediatrician, trisomy 21 kids, right? Most common chromosomal abnormality in humans, 5,000 babies per year, 350,000 individuals in the U.S. with trisomy 21. And as a pediatrician, you're doing annual screens on those kids, looking for AML. Sometimes you'll catch them post-acute viral infection, EBV, bone marrow suppression. It's a lot of work. It's a challenging position to put a general primary care provider in. Like listening to the thought process of, innovative idea, patent, market, timing. Does it go the other way sometimes when a commercialization product or entity will produce or find something of value that makes population health improved with better patient outcomes? Like, does it work the other way as well? And could you give me an example of that?
I might not be the best person to give an example, but what I think you're illustrating is sort of a mission-driven commercialization process where it might not be perhaps a $2 billion market, but there's a clear mission-driven aspect to the technology. And those are just as important that we have to be advocating for and convincing investors to look sometimes beyond the dollar figures. I think some of the burden also comes on the investigators to hopefully reveal the platformability of the technology, right? So it might have applicability to a rare disease population, but also be applied to other disease indications. And that's simply, understanding the biology well enough and realizing opportunities in other markets.
Can I just make one comment on that? One interesting trend that is occurring and emerging and accelerating today is the matching of private wealth to those kind of problems. And I think that is, sort of social entrepreneurship or the aggregation of really more direct, more specific, not creating a foundation to do something, to be very direct against something someone's passionate about is really starting to impact areas like that where you see more intentional support, especially around rare diseases or social determinant issues, those kind of things.
Excellent. So that is the entirety of our questions that we received. So just would like to thank everybody for a wonderful grand rounds, kind of giving us all a much better overview of, what is involved in the process. It's a whole lot more than what I had originally understood. So just a reminder, don't forget to evaluate today's session and text your attendance, and we'll see everybody next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.